What is up, everybody? Mr. Curtis here. Welcome to Unit 6 on the Modern Era. This is part 4, which is the last part, the second to last video for AP World. This is on what's called new conceptualizations of the global economy, society, and culture. Essentially, what this refers to is what we call kind of globalization, the idea that our world has, in the past 100 or so years, has become much more interconnected, dependent on each other, both through economic means, societal means, cultural means, that we've seen kind of that gap that we see in earlier time periods start bridging and people kind of coming together more with similarities and all that good stuff. So let's get started. Here we go. So first thing, a couple different points within here in this globalization. The first is this idea that states, by states I mean countries, communities, individuals are going to become increasingly interdependent, meaning I'm dependent on you, you're dependent on me. And what we see is these new institutions that involve global governance, meaning that they span across regions, they connect different groups of people and different states and different countries. We specifically see this after World War II. And the idea is, after World War II, how can we avoid a World War III? And a lot of people come up with this idea of, like, let's try and be more interconnected and work together. Remember, this is also during the Cold War, so we have that piece as well. But a couple of things that we have. One is we have these new changing economic institutions, new economic, international, for the most part, groups that attempt to kind of solve some problems. One example that I want to give them, there's tons of examples, but one example is what's called the World Bank. This is an international organization. So basically there's 188 countries, and all these countries are part of the United Nations. Basically, the idea is that the wealthiest couple countries in the world will provide loans to developing countries around the world. And the goal of providing these loans is to basically try and end poverty and to share prosperity. So, for example, the United States, Great Britain, France, and some of the Western European countries and Canada pool their money together, and then they loan out this money to underdeveloped or developing countries in hopes that they can end poverty. And you can see this is, we're going back between 2015 and 2019, and that the 19 is the projections, but you can see any country that is in blue or orange are some of the countries that are taking loans, and then the projections of who will be taking loans in 2019. So a large area here in sub-Saharan Africa are taking loans. We'll get to why in a second, but that's called the World Bank. The other is we have this regional free trade, these areas within regions that are going to allow for free trade. And if you don't know what free trade means, it basically ends tariffs or taxes. So for example, prior to this North American free trade agreement, if Mexico wanted to ship goods and sell goods in the United States would put a tax on those goods to encourage people to buy US made goods. And by putting the tax on the Mexican goods, it would raise that price in the United States of those Mexican goods to make it so the US market or the US goods were of the same or less price than the Mexican goods, because the Mexican goods generally are cheaper because labor is cheaper in Mexico. As a result of NAFTA, it's free trade exchange between the US, Mexico, and Canada, and this improves relations between the countries. They're connected economically, and generally if you're connected economically, you're going to be connected politically too. Also, there is the creation of the European Union, and the European Union is all these countries in Europe. Remember, these countries have been at war for most of the 20th century, and now they are connected with the European Union. Basically, it ends tariffs. It allows workers to migrate between different areas within these different, or in between countries, and also they're on the same currency. So all the countries in dark blue are on the euro. Great Britain in 2016 voted to leave the European Union in what was called the Brexit. So that was kind of an issue. Also, we have movement B here. So one is these global governance. Two is there's going to be movements around the world to kind of protest the inequality of environmental and economic consequences of globalization. So this globalization is happening, we're more interconnected, and then there are groups who are protesting against it. So we have the World Bank, we have these free trade agreements, we have a lot of this globalization going on, and then some groups are going to protest it. One is GREENPEACE, international organization. They really focus on environmental issues, so climate change, deforestation, nuclear issues, whaling in the Pacific Ocean, overfishing, pollution, and especially considering or with respect to fossil fuels, so oil, natural gas, fracking. And Greenpeace is this international organization, and they usually do these kind of bold statements. So this is a blimp. Say Hillary, say no to fossil fuel. After Trump was inaugurated, they rented this crane, and right outside the White House, they put resist. So they're kind of like a radical environmental group that are really protesting these consequences of globalization. Also, we have people who are going to think about society and culture in new ways. And the term here is conceptualize, how you view society and culture. And it's going to be new from what we saw in the past time period. Really, we're going to see a lot more focus in the 20th century and 21st century on rights. What rights do people have? We're going to see a lot of discussion on rights. And it's going to challenge really a lot of ideas of race and class and gender and rights that people deserve that we didn't really see in the previous time period. So in the previous time period, we saw about the Enlightenment and natural rights, but really it was focused on kind of rich, white bourgeoisie men. And then in the 20th century, we're going to see this challenge. One thing we're going to see in the 1960s, especially in the Western world, and again, by West, I mean Western Europe and the United States, is we're going to see global feminism. So we're going to see the rise of this idea that women are going to challenge these old norms. And by feminism, I'm referring to the belief that women should be completely equal to men. That's at the root of feminism. And in this case, we're saying women are in the 1960s are going to protest little things like they should be able to wear miniskirts if they want. Society and a lot of countries in the 1960s banned miniskirts and dresses had to be such a length. In some places, women are going to protest the being treated differently at work, not getting the same rights as men at work, being paid less than men, not getting pensions or retirement benefits. Eventually, it's going to turn into, in the late 60s, early 70s, is the right to birth control and the right to abortion. Some women in Atlantic City in, I think, 1968, there was a women's march to protest against Miss America pageant because they believed it was objectifying women. So we see these new things. You wouldn't see these in the previous time period, but it's kind of this continuation. Women get the right to vote, and then they start looking at other rights and other ways that they are being oppressed. This idea of women's rights is going to spread to the southern and eastern hemisphere. But here's the deal. So it kind of starts in the West in the 60s. And when it spreads, it's not going to be the same thing because what the people need in Latin America and Africa and East Asia and South Asia is different than what women need in the West. So there's going to be totally different goals. So for example, in Morocco in 2004, and Morocco is in North Africa, we're going to see women's protests because women have been viewed as minors in the eyes of the law. So the same kind of the idea of how the courts viewed women, they viewed them as like a 13-year-old. Even if you're a 65-year-old woman, you're viewed in the eyes of the law as a minor. So you need your husband to come or your son to come to represent you because you can't make decisions on your own. So we're going to see that kind of protest. You'd never see it in the United States, but you see it here. In India in 2006 or 2016, there's these huge protests against gang rapes. These men who had gang raped women in different parts of India, New Delhi specifically, are going to protest and go out and protest that the victims aren't getting full representation and aren't being their issues aren't being recognized. In the 1970s in Chile, we see the exposing of human rights abuses by the government. These women are going to go out and protest because there's a dictatorship in the country, and there are lots of people who are dying. If men had protested, they probably would have been killed. And some people believe that men weren't brave enough to go out and protest. But women, the matriarchs of the family, are going to go out and protest against these disappearances and these deaths of these people. Relatively successful and a little more powerful coming from women than men. But just the difference between the West and the East and the Southern Hemisphere. We also see the United Nations Declaration of Human Rights. Anyone who joined the United Nations after World War II, because it was created after World War II, has to sign off on these universal human rights, these basic human rights that we see in the Enlightenment that are now universally, and by universal I mean across the globe, recognized. So freedoms, no discrimination against people based on race or gender. So if you join the United Nations, you are supposed to sign off on this Declaration of Human Rights. Also, we see increased access to education, and political and professional roles become more inclusive. So a couple things that we're going to see: people get more education, and also we're going to see kind of these old discriminatory ways go to the wayside or leave. So after India gains their independence, for example, we see the attempts to end the caste system. So they create this system in India where it's called the reservation policy, where certain amount of seats in Congress, certain amount of seats in college classrooms are reserved for low caste, formerly low caste people, untouchables, for example. So the idea is we need to get rid of this caste system. We need to make some more equality in this country. So let's reserve a certain amount of seats, which is called affirmative action, everywhere in India for untouchables. So like maybe we give 10% of the seats in a college classroom to untouchables. Some people don't like this. They feel like it's giving where basically they would be letting anyone into a college classroom, but they are trying to even things out. Also, women are going to get the right to vote around the world. Obviously, these are the dates. So 1920s and 30s, the US, you can see where the blue is. The countries that are in red are areas in the 1990s that gave women the right to vote. The yellow is the 60s through the 80s, and the green is the 40s to the 60s. So you can see kind of this idea of women getting the right to vote spreads around the world, which gives people political power, specifically women. Last but not least is pop culture. Pop culture is going to become universal. There's a lot of things we'll talk about in class with this, but specifically I just want to look at, this is sports and what is the most popular sport in each country. So it's up for debate, but for the most part, most people would agree that American football is the most popular sport in the United States. You'll notice that it's not the most popular sport anywhere else in the world. However, all of this green here is football, or AKA soccer. And you can see soccer is a universal sport. It's not the most popular in the United States, but if you go around the world and ask people some of the most famous soccer players, most people around the world will recognize them. One thing in the United States that's pop culture related is rap music. Rap music has spread throughout the world. You can find a McDonald's in pretty much any country in the world. And that in some ways is popular culture. And again, by universal, I mean it spreads around the world. This is culture spreading. When before culture was kind of isolated in pockets in previous time periods, we see a change in this time period where it is universal. So that's what I got for you. Second to last video. Hope you enjoyed it. Hope you have a good day. Any questions? Write it down.